Acts chapter 9. We're going to finish up this chapter tonight as we look at On Mission Together. Tonight we're going to look at this subject, when direction meets preparation. So what's interesting in the narrative of Acts, we're looking at the early church, and it stops and it picks up on Saul's conversion. And we saw that last week. Then Saul disappears off the picture, who is later the Apostle Paul. He picks back up later in chapter 11. So the scene is back to Peter again, and how God is preparing him out of his comfort zone to open the door to the Gentiles to be saved. Let's look at this progression tonight. We're in Acts 9, verse number 32, all the way to verse 43, as we pick up there this evening here in a little bit. In verse number 32, now it came to pass, as Peter went through all parts of the country, that he also came down to the saints who dwelt in Lydda. There he found a certain man named Aeneas, who had been bedridden 8 years and was paralyzed. And Peter said to him, Aeneas, Jesus the Christ heals you. Arise and make your bed. Then he arose immediately. So all who dwelt at Lydda and Sharon saw him and turned to the Lord. At Joppa there was a certain disciple named Tabitha, which is translated Dorcas. This woman was full of good works and charitable deeds, which she did. But it happened in those days that she became sick and died. When they had washed her, they laid her in an upper room. And since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples had heard that Peter was there, and they sent 2 men to him, imploring him not to delay in coming to them. Then Peter arose and went with them. When he had come, they brought him to the upper room, and all the widows stood by him weeping, showing the tunics and garments which Dorcas had made while she was with them. But Peter put them all out and knelt down and prayed, and turning to the body, he said, Tabitha, arise. And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. Then he gave her his hand and lifted her up, and when he had called the saints and widows, he presented her alive. And it became known throughout all Joppa, and many believed on the Lord. So it was that he stayed many days in Joppa with Simon, a tanner. So the question is not just, do we want comfort? It is, do we want a harvest? And even more, are we willing for God to move us and stretch us and prepare us so he can direct us? Because in Acts chapter 9, here as we just read, we see this truth. God brings preparation and direction together for the sake of his mission. Now, this is not just Peter's story. This is the story of a church learning to move together. Jesus said in Acts 1:8, the theme key verse of the whole book, you're going to be witnesses to me. You're going to be witnesses to me with the gospel in Jerusalem. Then it later goes to Judea and Samaria, then to the uttermost part, to the ends of the earth. And every step required them to leave what was familiar together. And Peter is very central in this transition. If you are reminded that Jesus told him there at Caesarea Philippi, I'm going to give you the keys. Peter, on this rock, I'll build a church. Peter is very central because in Acts chapter 2, he preaches at Pentecost. The door is open for the Jews to come to know Christ as Savior. In Acts chapter 8, we see him, he helps to open the door to the Samaritans. In Acts chapter 10, we'll look at in a couple weeks, because the spring breaks next Wednesday, but in a couple weeks, he's going to open the door to the Gentiles. But before Acts 10 happens, God is doing something in Acts 9. Through going to a place named Lydda and Joppa, he is preparing Peter while directing Peter. In our lives, he prepares us while he directs us. But to get Peter there, Luke picks back up on him here in verse 32 through 43, and we see how the Lord is preparing him. He's moving his steps so that the incredible conversion of chapter 10 happens in Cornelius' house. He's leading him all the way to Cornelius' house, though he does not know that yet. So the point of this passage is simple. God uses what we would never choose to take us where we would never go. We see God expanding the border of Peter and getting him uncomfortable, moving him where he needs him, and the gospel gets proclaimed. So Peter takes the full opportunity and advantage to preach Jesus and not glorify himself. And he's bringing hope to these two places, Lydda and Joppa, if you see where they're in the vicinity of Jerusalem there. This evening we'll look at these places that he went in transition and what the Lord does in each situation with a focus on the individual, the area, and 3 lessons for us all to learn when it comes to the idea of when direction meets preparation. Let's look at the first lesson tonight, lesson number 1. And we find in lesson number 1, verses 32 through 35, here's the lesson. So get up, make your bed, and get going. These are what's called the uncontrollable situations. So let's look at this thought here. Verse number 32, Peter had just come out of a paralyzing situation. Persecution, scattering, uncertainty. Instead of staying comfortable in Jerusalem, Peter is moving. Verse 32, it says he travels through all parts of the country, all the regions. Then he comes to Lydda, the saints who dwelt in Lydda, a key crossroads of commerce, of military, of movements. This was 11 miles southeast of Joppa, 25 miles from Jerusalem. Today you'll find there in Lydda, today's location is the Ben Gurion Airport. If you go to Israel, you'll touch down at Ben Gurion Airport. That is where ancient day Lydda was located. That's exactly the kind of place where God plants gospel influence. There he meets this man named Aeneas. For 8 years, a certain man named Aeneas, for bedridden 8 years and was paralyzed. 8 years, a prisoner in his own body, dependent on others, no independence, no hope of change. And here's what's powerful. Peter comes from a paralyzing situation of persecution in Jerusalem to a paralyzed man. That's not coincidence. That's direction meeting preparation. In the midst of paralyzing situations, we find there's uncontrollable situations that Peter he's getting moving. But notice the advice he gives to this guy, Aeneas, refusing to make excuses. He comes up to him and he says, Aeneas, Jesus the Christ heals you. Arise, make your bed, get going. He arises immediately. Now think about this. That instance is a parallel of what Jesus did in John chapter 5 when he healed the lame man by the pool of Bethesda. He said, arise, take up your bed and walk. No spotlight, no theatrics, just clarity. Jesus Christ heals you. And immediately he gets up. The simple command when he says to make your bed, that matters. Because faith isn't just believing. Faith is believing, but it's not just believing, it's acting upon what God has done. Faith that doesn't move isn't a faith that trusts. Once the storm is over, it's a little awkward at first to get your bearings on a new normal. Because every time we go through a storm or what's called a paralyzing situation, you got what's called the new normal. And it's hard to get your bearings at first. But the Great Commission compels us. Go. Action word. Get up. Get going. Do what you can. That's what Peter did. He came to this paralyzed man. And the result? It says, he arose immediately, and look at verse 35. All who dwelt in Lydda and Sharon saw him and turned to the Lord. Now this wasn't just Peter moving. This was the church learning how to move together. When God brings us all out of a hard season, as he did Peter, as he did this paralyzed guy, will we move or will we stay when it's comfortable in uncontrollable situations? Are we as a church willing to step forward again together on mission when you have uncontrollable situations? Let's look at the second lesson as we move on from Lydda to Joppa. This goes from an uncontrollable situation to an unusual situation. Lesson number 2, rise up, for the helping hand is also helped. Let's break this down here. So Peter is called to Joppa, 11 miles from Lydda. In the midst of tragedy, hold on a second here, in the midst of tragedy, there's faith. A woman named Tabitha. Now it says it's translated Dorcas, that's her Greek name. She's died. We find in this text that she was known for her good works. She was known for her charity. She was known for serving others. She was a true helping hand. She was one of those ladies in the church that if she dies, the whole church misses, because she was such a glue to the church. Just anything that she's that person that just serves, and our church is filled with those people. But she was well loved, well known. But something unusual happens here. Notice what it says here. She was full of good works and charity, and she became sick and died. But notice what they do in verse 37. They just wash her body and lay her in the upper room. Guys, in that culture, that's highly unusual. Because normally burial would begin immediately after death in that culture. But instead they wash her. They place her in an upper room. And they send urgently for Peter. It's almost as if they're expecting God to do something. They didn't have a guarantee, but they had faith that God could still work. In the midst of tragedy, there's faith, but I also see this, that in the midst of sorrow, there's hope. Look at verse 39. It says Peter arose and went with these guys. Now, rather than bury her immediately, as they would be doing with Jewish culture, they washed her corpse. Now, this is an unusual scene. Now, think about this. They simply just washed the body, the upper room. Let me tell you about this. The space normally reserved for dining and housing special guests. Now think about this for a second. All right, in our culture, somebody passes away. We are not going to wash their body and place them in our dining room, right? Or our guest room. That was the equivalent of what they were doing here. We call the funeral home, they pick the body up, they prepare for burial. Okay, this is a usual scene. So this signals to us as the reader of expectation. They seem to be preparing this woman for resurrection. And that's remarkable because Luke's narrative here gives no indication that anybody had been raised from the dead since Jesus rose from the dead. As far as we know, these friends have no precedent to think that Peter could do anything other than officiate Tabitha's memorial service. But we see Peter arriving here. He arrives. We find he brought in the upper room, verse 39. The widow stood by him weeping, showing the tunics and garments which she had made while she was with them. So he sees evidence of the love that she had made. She sees other grieving widows lamenting. And we see, verse 40, he puts them all out. He sends them all out of that room. And it says he kneels down and prays. No showmanship, no assumption, just dependence on God. Then he says, Tabitha, arise. Now this particular miracle echoes the resurrection of Jairus' daughter by Jesus. When Jesus resurrected Jairus' daughter, he said, Talitha Kumi, little girl, arise. In a play on words, you find Peter, Tabitha, arise. There's a play on words there in the original language. It reflects, because these miracles are reflecting what Christ, he was pointing people to what Jesus did to give them the gospel. But we find he does that and she lives. In the midst of tragedy, there's faith. In the midst of sorrow, there's hope. In the midst of life, there's love. Look at verse 42. He presented her alive. It became known throughout all of Joppa, and many believed on the Lord. They loved her so much, they rejoiced when she was alive. So what's the point here? Just like Aeneas, there in Lydda, this is not about Peter. This is about Jesus, the one who not only heals and raises, but will one day raise all who trust in him. He's just pointing to Jesus, the great physician, the healer. If we're ever healed of anything, it's Jesus that does it. And one day when we die, we will raise again in the resurrection because Christ is raised. All that was pointing to what Jesus did. And the result here, many believed on the Lord. So in the midst of tragedy, when there's tragedy in our life, there can be faith. When there's sorrow, there can be hope. And when there's life, there should be love. And here's a principle here I find. That God in his grace often blesses those who pour themselves out for others. Not as a formula, but as a reflection of his generous character. We find here the helping hand, Tabitha, is also helped by the Lord. That's an interesting lesson there. But this is all preparing for the third lesson in verse 43, just one verse. As chapter 9 ends, we see the third lesson. Stay up and wait for further orders. These are the uncomfortable situations. Notice what it says in verse 43. So it was that he stayed many days in Joppa with Simon, a tanner. Now this statement connects this story with this narrative with what's about to happen in chapter 10. Because Peter goes from what's unusual to what's uncomfortable. From uncontrollable to unusual to uncomfortable. Notice this, where you are can be uncomfortable at times. We find that Peter stays in Joppa. There's a picture of what Joppa looks like today by the Mediterranean Sea. The fact that Peter stays in Joppa matters there in this verse. Because Joppa is a place of decision. Think about this. Jonah chapter 1. It says Jonah came to Joppa. What did Jonah do in Joppa? Does anybody recall the story of Jonah when he went to Joppa? God said, go to Nineveh, and he goes to Joppa. What's he do in Joppa? He runs from God's call to the Gentiles. Now, Peter is in Joppa, being prepared to go toward the Gentiles. Once again, the Bible, look at the coincidence here in Scripture. That's very, very powerful. Now, notice this. Not only where you are can be uncomfortable, but who you are with can be uncomfortable. Where is he staying at? Well, in the house of Simon the tanner. All right? Now, understand something. Simon did not have a tanning bed where they tanned. This is not what it's talking about. Okay? A tanner worked with dead animals. They were considered ceremonially unclean. They lived outside the city due to the odor of the dead animals. And yet Peter is staying there. Why? Well, Peter would never, ever stay there when he was before Christ died and rose again. He would never do that because God is stretching him. Preparation is meaning direction. You see Peter here being prepared. It's not about Peter, it's about Christ. But you also see Christ preparing Peter. God often works on us, and as long as we're alive, he will never stop working on us before he works through us. So before he works through us, he works on us. Before Acts 10, before Cornelius, before the Gentiles, God is already working on Peter's heart. Sometimes where we are in life or who we are with in life can be uncomfortable at times. It may not be permanent. It wasn't going to be permanent with Simon the Tanner. It's preparation for where God is about to send us next. So with this in mind, we've looked at the uncomfortable situations, the unusual situations, and we've looked at the uncontrollable situations. Notice this application, if you could. God uses uncontrollable moments. God uses unusual moments. God uses uncomfortable moments to bring direction and preparation together. We can look at everybody's life tonight. Think about the time where you had situations and moments that you were out of control. There was no control whatsoever. You felt like you just had, whatever you did, then you had those unusual moments, like this is a very unusual day. When you have those moments that are very uncomfortable. And you look back on your life and you find that God has used those to direct you and to prepare you for a mission, for a mission to give the gospel to somebody or to be there for somebody. So the question is, are we resisting tonight what God is using to prepare us? Are we willing to get uncomfortable? Or do we want to see a harvest of souls coming to Christ? And not just individually will we move forward together. Because when we demand comfort before obedience, we delay the faith. But when we trust Him, we step into His mission. So we find that this is bigger than Peter. This is the movement of the gospel through a people with one heart and one mission, and that mission has not changed. We're not just studying Acts. We are studying a continuation of what God has started. Because God is still, even from Acts to now, God is still preparing His people. God is still directing His people. And God is still sending His people. And the question is not just what Peter did, but what will we do together on mission? Because the mission was never meant for one. It was meant for all of us who believe Christ, who trust Him. My mission may be different than yours, or our paths may be different. But at the end of the day, the mission is the gospel. To be in a place to direct us, to prepare us, to share the gospel with somebody. To witness of the wonderful death, burial, resurrection